Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our talk by Dr. Jim McGrath. I'm really happy to be welcoming you to our April event for the DEFCon speaker series. DEFCon, as you probably know, is an initiative funded by the Andrew W. Foundation, run by me, my colleague Kasia Valens at Salem State, Sonia Donaldson at New Jersey City University, Tanisha Taylor at Texas Southern University, and Eleanor Pugh at Cal State Fullerton. And we're trying to build the capacity on our campuses and at other regional comprehensive universities to teach courses in the intersections of digital humanities and ethnic studies fields. So I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Jim McGrath, for his talk, Networks of Injustice, Reflections on Teaching Digital Public History and Data Literacy. Dr. Jim McGrath is living and working on the lands of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket peoples. He's currently an instructional designer at Salem State University, so we're very lucky to have Jim at Salem State. And a faculty associate in Arizona State University's School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. And Dr. McGrath has worked on several digital public humanities projects, including Mapping Violence, the Rhode Island COVID-19 Archive, and our marathon, the Boston Bombing Digital Archive. His writing has appeared in Doing Public Humanities, American Quarterly, The Public Historian, Digital Humanities Quarterly, and Reviews in Digital Humanities. So without further ado, I will pass this over to Dr. McGrath.
Thanks so much, Roopsie. And thanks to you all for attending this talk. I know today is Monday, yes? I've been working all weekend, sorry. Just trying to situate myself here. Okay, and I am going to do the thing that everyone does, where I say I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to put my slides up. Roopsie, can you give me a thumbs up that the slides can be seen? Great, okay. So today's talk is gonna focus on like a really particular class course teaching scenario, but my hope in kind of walking through some of the both the kind of pedagogical dimensions of it and also the content that gets covered in this course. My hope is that some of the material that we covered or some of the approaches we covered are applicable for a bunch of different contexts, because it was kind of a unique situation that led to this particular type of approach to teaching, although I think it could be more common ideally down the road, but collaborative teaching is a bit, it's not as widespread as we might hope it would be. So I guess I'm going to start by, just talking a bit about how, while I'm going to walk through some reflections on a particular course that I co-taught with Dr. Monica Munoz-Martinez and Edwin Rodriguez at Brown University as part of the ethnic studies curriculum there, which was also connected to the American Studies department. But one thing that I really want to kind of emphasize when I'm talking a bit about this work is I find this quote from bell hooks to be particularly generative. When I first started teaching way back in, well, not super way back, but in 2003, in my early 20s, I was trained to teach in a kind of metacognitive approach to teaching. And part of the reason that I was encouraged to teach in this way was because I was teaching, my first teaching job was a reading enrichment program where we taught students at the K through 12 level. And then for many of those students up until I think the junior high school level, we also had parents in the room as well. So we would go through our lessons, we'd go through what we were doing in terms of the engagement with the material and stuff, but then we'd also have to step back and talk a bit about what we're doing and why we're doing and why we made certain choices on that day. So I think that kind of ended up being a fortunate situation to be in, because I think in taking up some of this work in the classroom, I think transparency and dialogue are really key components of this work. I mean, so for instance, in this class, and I'll walk through this in a bit. There were questions about like, well, why are you all qualified to teach on the subject of state-sanctioned racial violence, right? So we talked about that and how we all kind of came together to take up this course. We were really kind of conscious about why we were teaching, adopting certain strategies in terms of choice of text and even the type of coursework we were taking up, because some of the coursework that we're asking students to take up, which I'll get into in just a second, was a bit different from some of the other kinds of courses offered at Brown or other schools. So I would really kind of just encourage people, as you're thinking about taking up this work, or as you're doing this work yourselves, to really kind of think about those opportunities for dialogue, those opportunities for transparency. And I think the other aspect I like about Bell Hooks's work is really kind of thinking about how the encounters we have in the classroom do change on this kind of day-to-day basis, week to week. The same kind of course material might look different at a different stage in life, or at a different stage in time, and things like that too. So the particular course that I'm going to talk a bit about is a course called Mapping Violence. This course was taught in the spring of 2020. It was an undergraduate course that met once a week. And it was co-taught by three people: myself, Dr. Martinez, and Edwin Rodriguez, who was a teaching assistant at the time and is still pursuing his studies at Brown. Dr. Martinez is now at UT Austin, where she's still taking up this work. But this course came about because Dr. Martinez has over the course of her career been really interested in stories of state-sanctioned racial violence at the Texas and Mexico border, particularly in the early 20th century. And as she was doing kind of more traditional academic research, working in the archives, and things like that, she started to take up an approach that we might consider more along the lines of, say, public history or public humanities. And then some digital dimensions started to get added to that as well. So Dr. Martinez, had a traditional output for some of the extensive research and work with primary sources and descendants, of people who encountered this violence, at this period in time, via The Injustice Never Leaves You, the publication that came out a few years ago. But as she was starting to think about other ways to raise awareness about some of this content, the idea of doing something digital started to appeal to her. So when I got to Brown in 2015 as a postdoc in the Center for Public Humanities, which had a good, strong relationship with the American Studies Department, I was kind of a newer digital humanities person who kind of entered the scene, and Dr. Martinez and I kind of hit it off. And then I eventually started to work on the project, as it was unfolding at Brown, and was offering consultation advice and thoughts on how to think about taking some of these stories of state-sanctioned racial violence, from some of the archival materials that she and other collaborators had uncovered, and moving it into a digital space. And then we also had, prior to the course, we had an opportunity to work with some undergraduates to actually contribute to the project. And that became a really helpful staging ground in retrospect to really think about how to work with undergraduates with this pretty traumatic and at times pretty intense subject matter, to get them thinking about the importance of recovering this history and thinking about this history, but also to be thinking about some of the public history, public humanities potential outputs to it. So like we had lots of conversations about why and how we were moving this content into a digital platform, and what sorts of information we'd like to emphasize, and how we were kind of taking some of the archival materials that we were looking at and kind of reimagining it for different audiences, or to place new points of emphasis on it, whether that was spatial points of emphasis, like giving people a sense of where some of these incidents occurred, or reimagining the text, right, and the points of emphasis in the text-based narrative storytelling that we were seeing in some of the newspaper accounts and other records that we were encountering in the archives there. And so we moved into thinking about this in a course context. And part of the reason that I was brought in to the course context was to kind of lend some digital humanities, digital methodologies contributions to the course. And I will say, right now, like, I have definitely incorporated some of the approaches that I took up in collaboration with Dr. Martinez and Edwin in this course, but I have not taught another version of mapping violence since doing this course in 2020. It's the state-sanctioned racial violence and the subject matter it's not my research specialty. It's not my core interest. Dr. Martinez has really extensive, deep knowledge on this, and I think that's an important thing to consider when considering certain topics and subjects is your students are going to want to know well, who's in the room and who has the credentials and why are you, what is your kind of relationship to this work, right? So in the context of this collaborative environment, right, we had a really deep subject specialist. We had someone who was doing some public engagement work in Texas. We had someone with deep ties to Texas, and then we had someone who had been working on the project for a number of years, since 2015, who was bringing that sort of digital perspective, digital specialty, had some awareness of the context, and the historical research there, but this was kind of identifying certain strengths and calling attention to that stuff is really important. And Dr. Martinez, when she's talked a lot about kind of the aspirations for what kinds of students she'd like to work with and how she'd like to steer students in a certain way, she often brings up this quote from Jessica Marie Johnson about hybrid practitioners, right? This idea that you can have people who have different levels of expertise or different specialties, whether it's methodology or subject, and then you can bring them into conversation with each other and think about sort of the potential for hybridity in there when you have people all in the same room. And part of the reason that we were interested in this approach was because in the earlier stages of doing some collaborative work with undergraduates, we had computer science students who had not had a lot of experience with ethnic studies or American studies, who had kind of come across the project or ended up working on the project due to connections that they had on campus with other students. And then we had students who were really invested in American studies, but maybe didn't have as much context or knowledge about some of the digital approaches. And bringing all these students into the same room and having them talk to each other and creating space for them to acknowledge some of their limits and in terms of prior experience and some of their interests and where some of that stuff might deviate or intersect was really generative and productive, right? So we really tried to think about how do we take this kind of hybrid practitioner model and move it into a classroom context, right? How do we encourage people to kind of come together and collaborate and work together? And part of this is kind of taking some of these collaborative methodologies that we value in public history work we're doing outside of the classroom and kind of bringing it into the classroom, kind of making the case for the value and the importance of this kind of approach to work rather than, just kind of working individually and kind of generating your own ideas and opinions in that way. So we really were trying to think consciously about that as we were developing this course. So I'm going to walk through some of the context that we brought into the class, and at this point, I'll be talking a bit about some of the particular texts and contexts that we're introducing to students, but then also how we were introducing them to students as well. So I think, one thing that was really important to us as we were developing this course was that we connected students to some methodological frameworks and perspectives that weren't necessarily explicitly digital, but were more thinking about some of the larger questions about history and the production of history, the development of history, and then how and encounters with historical materials, archival materials, primary sources, and things like that. So these are two of the core texts that were particularly important for us to introduce and talk about at the outset of the course. Silencing the Past is, it's at this stage is kind of a canonical text, I think, in public history work and in public humanities work. And Venus in Two Acts by Saidiya Hartman is a really great introduction to, perspectives on archival encounters with the archive that aren't, I think, in the context of a course that's trying to bring the potential of the digital to bear. This was particularly helpful because it helped complicate things, I think, in a productive way, rather than kind of insist that, like, these new digital tools and the ability to, read across large bits of text and kind of extract information and redeploy it and present it in certain ways is actually not the full story, right? There are these unquantifiable dimensions to the archive, and there are these, that we really want to call attention to also the encounters with the archival materials and some of the affective dimensions and some of the sort of feelings of loss that I think Hartman really does a nice job of emphasizing in this piece, right? So we didn't want to lose sight of this stuff. So I think, rather than kind of diving people into spreadsheets and visuals, data visualizations and things like that, it was really important to introduce some of these contexts to the class at an early stage. And some of our students at Brown had encountered these texts previously, but even some of the ones who had encountered them, mentioned in some of the responses that they gave that it was interesting to revisit these materials in the context of a course with digital dimensions and digital components, right? Because it kind of surfaced some of these things that we were hoping to surface. So it was kind of a mini success story, at least with some of the students, in terms of that kind of decision there. Another thing that we tried to think about in terms of the language that gets used to talk about racial violence and perceptions of the border and things like that was kind of bringing in other kinds of practitioners. So Dr. Martinez had a prior professional relationship with Michelle Garcia, who's a really great journalist who's been really thinking a lot about the border, particularly in our contemporary moment. Michelle Garcia actually came and talked to our students, this, I believe, was the second week of the semester, to talk about, like, what it's like to do this work as a practicing journalist, right? To really be thinking about stories of the border, to really be thinking about lived experiences of individuals who might be overlooked in, news media accounts or political debates about these various topics, and also what kind of language and kind of framing devices did someone like Garcia use to kind of make that case in a journalistic context. So there's a 3-part series that Michelle Garcia did for the Baffler, and the second installment in it, this idea of border theater, was particularly helpful for us to not just bring in the contemporary conversations, that about what was happening in the border in 2020 and in the 21st century, but also to think about how these kind of theoretical lenses and terms and frameworks do kind of circulate beyond academic, traditionally academic spaces, right? And how they can be useful to have conversations about some of the topics that we're really hoping to get at in a project like Mapping Violence. We also looked back at earlier attempts at gathering information, uncovering stories that may have been overlooked in particular accounts, or reframing some of those accounts in different ways. And some of you may be familiar with the 30 Years of Lynching in the United States project, but this was a particularly important project to introduce early in the semester as well, because it was really thinking about what it would mean to bring a whole bunch of these stories, together in one centralized location, and to engage with publics about, some of the patterns and trends, whether those are spatial trends or, some of the justifications given for violence, and other factors in there. It was really kind of important to bring that longer history to bear on the more recent digital interventions and digital approaches there too. And one thing that was pretty interesting about doing this work was the ways in which you know, there was kind of an understanding of the value of these kind of seminal projects and moments in this sort of longer history. But then we also talked a bit about some of the design choices, right, and some of the ideas of audience and the attempts at engagement that were happening here too. So like this visualization that we're seeing here, for instance, of 30 years of lynching, it was interesting to see it received by students who had these, more contemporary contexts and had an understanding of data, prior to the course and prior to, in the wake of 1918, looking at some of the design choices, made here. So like, for instance, looking at Arizona, on this map and just seeing the number 8 there, right? Or seeing these little like X's on there, right? It, one of the things that was useful to talk about was like how certain arguments are being made and how certain like gestures towards authority are being kind of deployed in the creation of visualizations like this. But also you can kind of tease out some of the limitations of some of these approaches, right? Like if you look at the 8 in Arizona, or you look at the blank number in Utah, right? Some of our students, were pretty savvy about saying, well, like that probably says some more to do with like gaps in the data itself or limits in the data that's been collected than kind of an accurate authoritative depiction of what actually happened over these few decades. So it was interesting to have those conversations and to also, make the case for the value of these things, but also what might be different if you were to take up some of these approaches in a contemporary moment where you have more resources available to you, where, the ability to take up this work, is very different than the particular dangers that, some of the people doing this work face, as they were gathering this information over the course of the country, right? Like things are more centralized and lots of, lots of really interesting stuff came up in there too. We also looked, for those of you familiar with, this time period or some of this particular subject matter at texts like The Red Record by Ida B. Wells Barnett. And, one of the things that was really helpful about this was, as we were thinking about our own project and the role that narrative played in that project and the role of like bringing all of these stories together in a particular way, but providing, organizing principles, for the data, for the narratives. The Red Record, was a really kind of generative piece to look at in terms of how things were organized in this particular way, how compelling some of the arguments made in this text were, but also what might be different about moving some of this stuff into a digital context. So it was really important to work with this longer history. And again, we spent a lot of time early in the semester thinking about the digital, thinking about the implications for data, thinking about the implications for visualization, but also looking at earlier, forms of technology, forms of dissemination. And I think in particular, as we look at somebody like Ida B. Wells Barnett, right? Like it's not just thinking about the text, but it's also thinking about the social dimensions around the text, right? Like some of the work of public engagement that were happening beyond this. And I think Dr. Martinez is a really great model for this kind of work, in addition to publishing work like The Injustice Never Leaves You and taking up work on a project like Mapping Violence, right? She's also out in Texas, doing, making connections with people, on the ground there, talking to descendants, doing public lectures, working on state-sanctioned markers, right? Like the marker for the Porvenir Massacre, which gets talked about a bit in the project itself and also in the original academic monograph. So thinking about how like, doing this work in a digital context, even if you've got like a ton of, data and information and you've mapped out, you've gone beyond the work of some of these previous projects, right? Like 30 Years of Lynching, there's still other opportunities and there's a need for public engagement beyond the project itself. We also talked about sort of earlier approaches to reimagine and recontextualize earlier primary and secondary sources, right? Because we did have students doing a fair bit of archival research in this course. So we wanted to look at earlier models like the Grimke sisters and the abolitionist database, that gets formed from, some of the runaway slave advertisements and other materials that were coming from the newspapers that they were acquiring and recontextualizing. So this particular piece by Ellen Gruber-Garvey, I think, is a really helpful one for thinking about, again, some of these earlier moments and bringing them into conversation with our contemporary moment. Raw Data is an Oxymoron is just kind of, I think, generally a pretty compelling book that does a lot of different, that really kind of complicates ideas of data in lots of really generative ways. We did look too at, when talking about like looking at newspapers and finding information there and kind of, and bringing it into context with other points of data. We did talk a bit about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and one of the particular areas that we focused on was covered in this article and video that was put together by the Vox journalistic publication. And one of the points of emphasis in this video that we wanted to highlight was the ways in which some of the records of the Tulsa Race Massacre are coming from these racist postcards that are circulating to kind of make a mockery of the incidents that took place and to kind of revel in the trauma and the violence and the damage that we're seeing there. And for those of you who might be familiar with a lot of the research that's been done on the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? There are these accounts where newspaper records are being ripped out of archival materials in an attempt to kind of suppress knowledge. And then, we're seeing these other types of objects getting reimagined in the archive and revisited for the purposes of calling attention to their traumatic dimensions and to the histories, the hyperlocal histories and the accounts that took place in these spaces. So there were lots of different models that we were trying to pull from in an attempt to really be transparent and clear about how what we were doing kind of fits into this larger continuum, and really trying to think about how to think about the originary sources of some of these points of data, and then also how they were mediated in their original historical context, right, and shaped in different ways. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. We also talked a bit about some of the local context at Brown in terms of thinking about, you might call it restorative justice, or you might call it kind of account reckoning with the role of slavery in the construction and the formation of these institutions. It was really interesting to read this particular report in 2020. If you go and look at the Slavery and Justice website and the framing of it, a lot of it talks about how kind of innovative and unprecedented and important it is. And what we found was a lot of our students wanted to talk about some of the limits of the framings that we saw in this report, right? And again, taking into account some of the other contextual dimensions we talked about with like the NAACP's work. But for example, it was really interesting to some of the students and to us as well as faculty that this report begins not with enslaved peoples, right? But rather with a clock, right? And with materials. And you can kind of see the academic, cleverness, of beginning with material culture kind of showing up here in the framing of this report. And that hasn't really held up, as well over the years as it may have seemed to be in, at this earlier stage. Obviously, material culture is really important, but it was a really interesting kind of rhetorical and storytelling choice that was made in the report that some of our students really kind of focused on and called attention to. And then also that informed how they were thinking about our own approaches to storytelling that we're taking up in the course as well. We also looked at some more recent models in digital restorative justice work. Dr. Martinez did have and I think still does have a pretty good relationship with the folks who are working on the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice project at Northeastern University School of Law. And you can see here, one of the things that I found valuable to talk about with regard to this project was the ways in which the emphasis is on restorative justice, not necessarily on the visualization or the digital initiative with the most bells and whistles, or the most innovative forms of visualization or anything like that. It's really clear that this project is kind of motivated by doing a lot of work on the ground while also disseminating information, connecting people to primary sources and secondary sources and individuals through digital context. And you can see here, I particularly like this screenshot of the project because it really does break down a lot of the different dimensions of restorative justice work. And yes, some of this stuff does intersect with digital context and components, but it also extends beyond the digital too. And I think that's really important. That's a really important reminder, or something that's really important to surface when you're doing this work in the classroom, right? If we're really serious about thinking about public engagement and connecting with publics, right? There are lots of different approaches that one might take to do this. So it's not necessarily to replicate all of this stuff in a single semester timeline, right? But to make people aware, make students in particular aware of the various kind of entry points and facets of this work. And then, of course, we did talk a fair bit about more recent data visualizations as well. So this particular one I like to start with because it's from 2015, so it's a little bit dated now, but it's clearly designed for it's imagining an audience that has a shorter attention span or a shorter amount of time than some of the projects that we might see, being produced by, academics or people invested in longer form storytelling using digital or augmented means here, right? And it's really transparent and clear about that, the Atlantic slave trade in 2 minutes. But one of the things that we emphasize a lot in this course when we're talking about and thinking about data, Dr. Martinez, the way that she often frames it in talks that she gives is she's interested in lives, not metadata, right? So it's like, how do we center the lived experiences, the perspectives of individuals, particularly individuals who are subjected to, great, troubling, traumatic violence, and how do we think about sharing those stories and centering those experiences and thinking about how to account for these experiences in our contemporary moment. So there are ways in which bringing this kind of project into the context of a course like Mapping Violence also kind of surfaces some of the limitations of this approach, right? It's kind of like a little bit too clever, right? Or there's a speed with which this project moves that is compelling from a certain light, but in other perspectives, it might seem like a little too fast, a little too kind of detached from some of the realities, that we're seeing in here. We also looked at projects like the Lynching in America project. One of the things that we really wanted to stress when we were taking up this work was drawing from sources that extended beyond, just that academic cluster, or like the NEH grant funded cluster, or the tenured professor cluster of these sort of digital initiatives, to really look at different contexts and different audiences. And different motivations in here too. So this was one particular project, right? The Equal Justice Initiative has really particular stakes and investments and motivations for sharing this stuff. We also do want to call attention to some of the dynamics and the relationships that they have with corporate groups like Google as well, and how that might inform a particular project, the limits of it, or the design of it, and things like that. And then we did also, look at projects that were in languages other than English. This particular project, really looking at a kind of a set amount of time and kind of visualizing materials in a few different ways, was another way in which we could kind of have generative conversations about some of the aesthetic design choices that were being made, and some of the narrative choices that were being made, and some of the ideas of audience that were informing some of these decisions on some of these projects, right? So we did kind of especially after we kind of introduced some of the the core motivating factors and some of the theoretical underpinnings of the course, we did do a fair bit of sharing projects, but also, sharing them in a way that didn't just talk about the content, but talked about design, talked about data, talked about like both the sources of data and the questions we had about the sources of that data, but also the visualization outputs, that were being produced there. And then we looked at projects that were similar to the Mapping Violence Initiative, right? Like the Lynching in Texas project, which is really interested in the kind of spatial dimensions of this work. We are slightly different in that this project is Mapping Violence is a little bit more interested also in this sort of how doing this work in the contemporary moment also asks us to think about some of the narrative, like text-based narrative choices that get made as we're representing this stuff in the contemporary context. So I'll move into that, and then I'm happy to talk more about the pedagogy in the in the time that remains after I walk through some of this final stuff. But this is a screenshot that I just took, earlier today. The Elon Musk Twitter deal, which might be on the minds of some people who spend too much time on Twitter. But this is a Twitter account that talks about and looks at how headlines at the New York Times get revised and take shape over the course of publications. And if you have seen this account on Twitter, you see that there are lots of really interesting conversations popping up about how the New York Times frames certain topics and kind of limits and constrains the public sense of certain topics there too. And we wanted to, as we were thinking about maybe more traditional text-based narratives, we did want to think about the fact that, in our contemporary moment, text is not always fixed neatly in place, right? When I talk to some of my colleagues who work in, or some of my friends who work in journalistic contexts, right? For instance, my brother who works in Major League Baseball for their website, when they are putting together a story, there are often tools that get used to help with search engine optimization that kind of introduce certain words or certain headlines that they think might work better in terms of the reach with certain audiences. So sometimes, I'll hear from, folks who work in media like, oh, well, they're just doing A/B testing. Like, what's the big deal? They're really just thinking about engagement. It's like, well, if you are someone who's been like spending a lot of time working with earlier news records, and historical accounts, particularly of things like racial violence, right? Like you know how important these decisions are when they do get preserved and revisited in these archival contexts, right? They set the tone in many regards for how some of these instances are received and reviewed, and we're seeing that in our contemporary moment as well in lots of different contexts beyond, things like Elon Musk and Twitter. So I think that kind of like, oh, it's just A/B testing, or oh, everything is kind of iterative and changing, right? Like that's an insufficient. That's kind of passing the buck, right, in terms of the responsibility that journalists and their editors and their publishers kind of owe to taking account for some of this stuff. But it is useful to think about in the context of asking students to think about how to revisit and to reimagine some of the stories that they're encountering in the newspaper record. So those we're out of order there for a sec. So for instance, this particular event description that was written by a student here is drawn from sources like this newspaper account from the El Paso Herald. And one of the things that we really tried to encourage our students to think about as we were getting them to work with data and to think about data about racial violence was how the narrative choices you make, how the organization of sentences, what the subject of the sentence is, what the verb of the sentence is, what the proper nouns of the sentence are, can be really important areas to consider when you're refashioning and reshaping some of these stories. So given that we're doing work in a digital space, right? Mapping Violence is designed so that the audience for the project is not encountering academic monographs on each of these subjects, which of course could be written on a lot of these instances, but rather, how do we get at some of the information that people are finding, our students are finding in the archives, and how do we represent it in a way that centers the victims of this violence and the lives that they had outside of this violence, and really think about that. That was a real. We spent a lot of time working with students on some of those decisions. We had each student in this course was asked to do two what we called case studies, where they took two instances of racial violence and they did a deep dive on some, they tried to find out how much information they could about these events, and they kind of acknowledged gaps in that information too when they came up. But then we also asked them to come up with a revised narrative about some of these stories that tried to be informed by, lots of the ongoing conversations that we were having about, how these records did go on to inform later perceptions of these incidents and of these accounts. So that was a really kind of key component of us too. We did ask our students to think about, things that you might expect in a digital course, that particularly course that's interested in spatial history, right? So like we asked them to look for coordinates that might help us map out the contemporary locations of some of these events, but we also did talk a lot about the ways in which Google Maps, right, and the coordinates on Google Maps, that's a more contemporary reimagining of space, right, than some of the instances that they might be encountering. They might be things that were mapped or referenced in some of these narratives that refer to different conceptions of space, right? So we did have location rationales here too, that where students could provide some additional context on whether they thought the map might have changed drastically, or whether there was just a lack of kind of clear identifying information about where a particular event took place. We did also ask, questions about, information about, what we call the victims of violence themselves. And then we did ask them to think about information about what we were calling the aggressors of violence in here too. And part of the reason for this was, the Mapping Violence Project, before it came into this classroom context, one of the things that we started to get interested in was what happens to these aggressors after these incidents take place, right? And is there a way that a data-oriented approach to this topic might help us think about where, like, do people move? Are there particular regions where in the country where particular aggressors seemed more protected, right, or more prolific in terms of their violence and activity there too? So we did center the experiences of the victims of violence, but we also did not try to lose sight of what might be of interest to people about the aggressors themselves too. So that's just kind of like a deep dive onto some of the decisions that we were making in the course to in terms of thinking about how to present some of this material. I'm happy to talk more conversationally about some of the pedagogical dimensions of this too. I mean, one aspect of this that I think is worth making note of is we really tried to think about the potential for a kind of lab model or a lab approach in a humanities context. This course, when it was offered at Brown, it only met once a week for a kind of long block of time. So that made it kind of challenging in terms of how to break up different types of work. I mean, we could of course break it up into smaller portions of the course, but they were, given how like weighty and intense and kind of emotionally draining some of this content was, we found it useful to have moments where we were kind of working with the larger theoretical framings and some of the and then thinking about the content itself. And then we had separate moments where separate days where we had a lab model where we were trying to teach students how to think through working with primary sources and secondary sources, with the goal of constructing these revised narratives and gathering this information that we're asking them to collect in there too. And what was generative about that was, like, we we would come in, we'd give like a short 5-minute kind of overview or talk about maybe a particular database or a particular trend that we were seeing in some of the narratives that were popping up. But then they were really spaces where students could go and look at some of the databases or some of the primary sources that we had kind of culled for them initially, and kind of work closely with those texts, ask questions with each other, ask questions with us, and kind of decentering the instructor's kind of authoritative voice in that way in some of those moments was really generative and important. Like we had students who were, working with each other and learning just how involved and intense and frustrating some of this work with archival materials could be. But they had, through the lab context that they had space to kind of talk about that with their peers, and then also to check in with us about particular frustrations, about particular contexts. And one other thing that we found interesting about some of that work is, I don't know if for people who have asked their students to work a bit with certain types of primary source materials, like say death certificates or birth certificates or things like that. One source that has a lot of this information digitized is Family Search, which I think some people might know. It's connected to the Mormons have been kind of gathering this stuff and collecting this stuff in different ways. And our students were asking questions about, well, why does this exist? And who's putting this together? What are the financial dimensions of this? What are the kind of desired outputs and stuff? And that helped us have conversations, not just about data, but also about some of the decisions that are informing the construction of databases and some of the ethical challenges that people face when working with digitized materials, right? So for those who don't know, Family Search makes use of prison labor in some of the metadata cleanup that they do, and we really wanted to be transparent and clear about those dimensions as we were investigating them as ourselves and talking about them, and really kind of thinking about not just the idealized version of kind of database creation and collection and dissemination that like, oh, this academic is it's open, it's accessible, it's engaging, but rather like a lot of this stuff is really kind of messy and challenging to wade through, and it got them thinking not just about databases in the context of this course and kind of historical research, but the collection and acquisition and use of data in lots of other contexts too, right? So there are lots of ways in which the conversations move beyond the subject matter and the kind of tasks that were taking up themselves to ideas of data literacy and information literacy that extended beyond that course there too. So I'll stop there for now, and just if we have time for some questions or comments, Roopsie, this is the time to do that? Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's very exciting. I feel like I've heard bits and pieces and admired it from afar. It's really nice to see, to hear you talk about it. So I encourage anybody to either raise your hand to ask a question live or to put a question in the chat. That would be great. I think while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I'm definitely interested to hear about some of the pedagogy that you use to sort of, how are you thinking about how to scaffold this as an experience that the students could really dig into, coming from these sort of with this hybrid practitioner model you mentioned of kind of coming to it with different sets of funds of knowledge.
Yeah, and I one thing I'm happy to share is just kind of like a one-pager that has a link to the syllabus that we used, and then also Dr. Martinez and myself have both written about some of this work in a more kind of deep dive way than this talk. So and also links to some of the projects and readings that we could share there too. But yeah, I think one of the things that we really tried to think carefully about was this kind of the question of scale, and then the kind of implications of having students do work that would eventually circulate publicly, right? So I think particularly in public history and public humanities, sometimes there are, and I've done this as well, right? There are projects where like some of the final outputs are just live on the web, in a much shorter span of time. And for a project like this, that really did not seem like the right move to make in terms of introducing students to new methodologies, new subject matter, new ways of writing about these sorts of topics. We didn't want to kind of like just kind of leave them kind of exposed in the event that like maybe they made some decisions that weren't the decisions we would have made, right? So we really tried to think about making the case for the value of an initiative like mapping violence. And that's why we looked at a whole bunch of different models there and really kind of compartmentalizing and thinking about like what would be like some smaller components of the project that undergraduates might spend some time working on, right? So we had, I think initially we had 3 case studies in mind, and then we scaled that back pretty quickly once we saw how much time and labor and concern, right, that some of the students had when they were taking up their first case study. We wanted to have more than one just because we didn't want students to feel like everything hinged on one particular thing. And we also got the sense that repetition of certain things might also help them think more about some of the narrative choices or some of the data oriented choices they might make there too. So that's what we settled on too. And again, it's not a ton of writing, right? Like in terms of the data points, but like there's so much labor that went into the research and the reflection and the engagement with materials that we weren't as concerned about like the word count at the end of the day. And sometimes that can be a challenge when you're kind of thinking about digital work and how to assess it. We did have reflection moments over the course of the semester. So students did do peer reviews of their case studies with one another that came about after we kind of modeled the kind of feedback that we would give. And part of the reason we benefited from having worked on this project before the course. So like we had reps for like revising and working with research and incorporating it in there that we could draw on. But we did want students to kind of have a chance to adopt that critical eye and to help out each other. So we did adopt the peer review model there too. And then they would submit their final version. We did all of this work in Canvas. And part of the reason I want to make note of that is this is probably the instructional design hat on is we didn't, they weren't putting all this stuff into the actual project database right away. We wanted to have that mediating presence there too, where we could evaluate and assess and then move the stuff in there too. But we also wanted to make sure that we were using digital spaces and contexts that everybody had access to and that everybody was familiar with. And we did introduce, everybody uses a learning management system like Canvas differently. So we did talk a bit about how we were using it. We also made use of Google Forms for some of the data that they were sharing just directly with us. We talked a bit about that, but that particularly came in handy due to COVID. Right. So this is a spring 2020 course that got disrupted by COVID. And I think if we had been working with like OpenRefine or doing stuff in spreadsheets or moving in a whole bunch of different courses, it would have been a lot more difficult to, try to keep, we didn't necessarily keep everybody on. We scaled back the work due to COVID for lots of different reasons, but students didn't have issues with trying to learn new tools or new contexts, or even just being thrown off by a new interface, that was different from what they were expecting to see there. So that's some of the pedagogical stuff, I guess, from C.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question from Joanne. So thank you for your inspiring talk, Jim. Which activity in the classroom worked well and which did not? And could you explain why?
Yeah, so I think the lab model where we had students working with, doing research worked particularly well because we did kind of seed that research. We didn't just say, go look at Google or here's the Brown library and go find things here. We did give them some PDFs of primary sources that had things like the Red Record or other things that had some content in there that they could take a look at. So they had a bit more of a foundation for research there too. And that work of kind of iteration and revision of the narratives, that seemed particularly successful. I think in terms of things that didn't work as well, I think there are some ways in which some of the data categories that we talked about, I think there, I maybe would have de-emphasized, like if I were to adopt this a bit further, I might just kind of focus more on kind of the narrative component of some of it, and really be a bit more selective in terms of the creation of data. I mean, and I'm really interested in data literacy, and I think that's an important component of this work, but I think I might shift that kind of work to have it be more, let's look at some of the decisions that are being made in certain databases. Let's talk about data and its impacts on the contemporary moment in different ways. I might kind of I might lessen the kind of expectations of the creation of data. And I think there's still plenty of ways to talk about data literacy without, because I think some of them got hung up on like the spatial location stuff, right? I think like there are ways that you can talk, like Vincent Brown has a really great piece called Mapping a Slave Revolt, where he talks a bit about, some of the work that he's done in kind of spatial conceptualizing and some of the limits and difficulties of it. Sometimes it seemed like we were, we had Sadia Hartman, we had Venus in Two Acts, right? And we're talking all about like the limits of archives and the unquantifiability of archives. And then it's like that particular data portion, it seemed like, okay, well, but we still want data, right? And that, I think that's where I would be a little bit more selective and strategic about that if I was doing a version of that later on. So.
Thank you. Liz has a question.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for this talk. I'm just so struck by like the range of sources that you worked with in the classroom, both primary and secondary. And I have a kind of a selfish question, which is like, how do you get students to move beyond the academic monograph, like particularly graduate students?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm asking this, I say it's selfish because I've been teaching a class this semester on digital archives, and it's like a digital humanities practicum. And many of my students are grad students in history who really like the academic monograph is like the thing, right? And everything else we look at is just kind of secondary or extra, right? And
yes,
of course, this is like part of the status quo of academic publishing and tenure and promotion and all of that. And they're aware of that. We have meta conversations about that, but it's still just like, they're like, yeah, but the monograph is like the real thing, right?
Yes.
So like,
no, for sure.
I'm curious how you deal with this, and like how this particular class where you're talking so much about violence and like what is data and what counts as data and how do we take it apart, dealt with this question.
Yeah, I mean, so this class was an undergraduate course. So that's, I mean, but I teach, I'm currently wrapping up a graduate course right now. And that's why I was nodding, because I think I'm teaching a graduate course right now in public history methodology. And I am encountering in some of the students are great and they're doing lots of really great work, but what you're describing is they are tendencies that I see in some of the outputs that I'm asking them to do. And we don't have a paper in my class. Like we don't have like a long form paper. We have case studies where I have them looking at, like there's one on looking at a historic preservation site and doing a kind of assessment and analysis of it there in a much smaller constrained way. But I still sometimes get like, things that are double or three times the word count, like, or things that make use of extensive quotation, like citation and quotations. Part of that's coming from like the larger ecosystem that they're in, right? Like that there are other instructors who are insisting on this. I find history departments to be pretty conservative in terms of some of these outputs, and then other things too. So I think as a public history practitioner, I sometimes am able to kind of steer them away from some of those monograph outputs. I mean, like, so, and with this class in particular, right, like, because we were so invested in like the attention and the engagement with the audience beyond the monograph, right? The monograph has already been written. This is aiming for different audiences. It was a little bit easier to kind of show that move to undergrads, and I think it would be in the same way to grad students. I do try to think about different kinds of genres when I can introduce them that move beyond the monograph approach, but that doesn't work with every single kind of course. Like, I mean, like with the course I'm teaching now, like, you know, some assignments you have the option to do like a lesson plan, or some, not to elevate you too much, Rupsi, like some of them are like, hey, what if you did, like, actually this week, one of their options is to do a version of a reviews in digital humanities summary of a project they've come across. And if you look at those, and I've written one, so I'm able to like talk a bit about that, right? They're kind of these hybrid documents where like you have the projects talking about their own sense of what they're doing, and then the review is a much more concise and kind of and there's a clear motivation for like, let's help make this more legible to tenure and promotion committees and things like that. So it's slightly different from the, you know, the 30-page journal article or monograph. So I try to steer people to stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's kind of like a different question from the other thing that I always like kind of run into a lot, especially because I use Canvas a lot, is like the discussion board genre, right, is like a real weird thing where it's like, it's where discussions go to die sometimes, right? If like you're not thinking about like the fact that it is networked and that there's a potential for dialogue. So I try to steer people towards different kinds of models for writing or storytelling, right? Like podcasts, right? I think we have a number of students who are really thinking about that. I have a few students in my class right now who are thinking a bit about genealogy, right? So steering them more towards the creation of a resource that will help other people who have different motives or interests than like a history professor looking for citations for their next monograph, right? Is one way to do that. Like the multimodality, I think, is one way to do it too. That does create extra burdens on you as an instructor, right? Because it's like, you know, if you're going to have them do podcasts, then you have to introduce all that stuff too. But yeah, I think that is a real lingering, particularly at the grad level. And I get it, because it's like, that's still the coin of the realm, right? Like, and I do want to encourage, you know, some, I do try to create some writing projects for students who are on that trajectory to say like, okay, this is a smaller version of something you could expand into a journal article or something. But I do even try to make that smaller, because I think sometimes, you know, in the smaller amount of space, you can figure out whether this actually is worth doing as a journal article or whether it hasn't been done before or something like that. Yeah, I'd love to hear other thoughts too, like other modalities and other genres, though, is the way that I've tried to address it. And I should have just said that instead of rambling for as long as I did. So
Thank you. So we have a question from Dimitri's. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Jim. It looks like there was a lot of time and effort invested in this collaborative course with an emphasis on dialogue, transparency, and mixed methods. Was planning and preparing this course supported in terms of available resources or in any other way? What sort of provisions, conditions for supporting such collaborative work among hybrid practitioners you'd say are most important in higher ed?
Yeah, super great question. I think, and this is something I do want to emphasize, is that like this was a really unique situation in that Brown, and particularly the American Studies Department and the Ethics Studies, you know, department were very supportive, of having not just the TA model, but also the co-teacher model there. And I was compensated for that work very well, in addition to Dr. Martinez, who was on a tenure track and had different things there, you know, different obligations and economic stuff there too. I think it is a lot of time and a lot of work. And I say this as an, I'm like the class I'm teaching, the public history methodology class I'm teaching for ASU now, I'm an adjunct. I'm making under $4,000 teaching that class, which is criminal. And I think that I am not taking up this kind of work in that environment, just because I don't have the capacity. I'm already overburdened and overstretched. I'm stretched way too thin in lots of different ways. So what I found though is that I'm taking like there are certain modules and certain readings and certain texts that I am taking and kind of bringing into that course at a much smaller scale, or as Liz just asked, right? I am finding ways to kind of steer students towards different genres, different modalities that I think are in line with the kind of hybrid practitioner outputs that I tend to value and find important. But yeah, I do think that to do this work well, you do really need the support of your institution at the particular scale that I do. So I try to think about like smaller like there are smaller slices that I could imagine doing as an adjunct, right? Like I could imagine doing a revision exercise where I have students look at primary sources and then try to rewrite those sources in a way that centers the experiences of the victims of violence, right? Like that's something that's manageable to me without a whole bunch of support, mechanisms in place there. But yeah, I think to answer your question really bluntly, we need more support, and we need, I am probably a case study in like how some of this work is not supported in certain ways, right? In terms of like my contingent and precarious nature as a scholar. And I do think it does inform how, like what you're able to take up, because, as we're saying here, right? Like introducing databases, introducing particular resources, or introducing digital tools, right? This is all extra labor on the part of the students as well as the instructor, right? And so you do need to kind of pick your spots and really think that that through in different ways. So I think if you're in a position where you can advocate for collaborative teaching, or you can advocate for kind of iterative approaches like this, or opportunities for collaboration. So like at Brown, in other courses I taught, I was able to bring in the visualization specialist from the library. Patrick Rashley was one of them at the time, to come in and talk a bit about best practices and approaches to design of visualizations. When I was briefly teaching at Northeastern, I worked a lot with Molly Brown, who was one of the archivists there, to come in and talk to undergraduates about doing archival research and about doing kind of close readings of particular texts. We were looking at like newspapers and thinking not just about, oh, we have access to this stuff, but like, let's think about some of the the storytelling choices and the narrative choices made to it. So you can do stuff at smaller scale, but yeah. And I think there are slices of mapping violence that could work in a wide range of contexts, but that full bore approach is really hard to replicate. And then also to support that work beyond the class, right? Telling somebody telling your department chair you're going to work on a database instead of working on a few different publications, right? That doesn't always go over well if you're not, especially because databases take years at times. Some people in the room might have similar experiences with that. So yeah, so sorry to answer your question with a bummer of an answer, but that's, yeah, it's hard.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question if there's anybody who has a burning question.
I think I just bummed everybody out.
No. Real talk is good. Oh, Liz says we were already bummed out.
Oh, I know, I saw.
No, I was saying this for the purpose of the recording, which
okay.
I have the chat on it. Well, on that note, no, this has been a really wonderful talk. So inspiring, the work that all of you have done, and really just exciting. So thank you so much, Jim. Yeah, I know Zoom is weird. Delighted to see all of you. Hope we'll see you at our virtual annual meeting on May 13th.
Yeah, and Rupsi, I will share some links for people interested, because like the syllabi and some of these other writings, they might be helpful for people to take a deeper dive on some of this stuff.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. All
Have a
right.
good night, everybody.
Take care, y'all.